As you know, from the 1st of January 2026, CBAM has now kicked in with financial obligations. The transitional period finished at the end of 2025, where data was only being collected, analyzed, and systems being assessed. From the 1st of January 2026, all imports of CBAM goods are now subject to the measure. So it's great to see many of you so interested in this topic. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll talk about CBAM, specifically looking at how companies can measure their their carbon exposure and their impact. All right, so with me today, I have two of my colleagues actually on the call. We've got Ribudio, our CBAM compliance expert and sustainability consultant. Ribu will talk through the technical side of CBAM, and that will be later on in this session. We also have Alejandra Hernandez with us today. She's going to kind of speak to the EU context and why CBAM actually exists today. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Kelvin. That is correct. European Union has the most ambitious climate target in the world. We want to become carbon neutral by 2050. And in order to get there, what the European Union did is that it has built a comprehensive legislative architecture. Many of you have heard about the European Green Deal, Fit for 55, EU emissions trading system, Repower EU, very important for energy, and the Net Zero Industry Act. All of this legislative architecture, they have binding targets across all the 27 member states. And as a consequence, this makes that the EU carbon price is the highest in the world. So a problem comes with this. If an European Union producer pay a carbon price and a foreigner producer do not pay this carbon price, imported goods with high embedded emissions, they become cheaper. And this, of course, undercut the European industry and what it produces, that European producers may be shifting production outside the European Union. And this is what is called carbon leakage. Undermines every climate target that the European Union have set. So in order to solve this problem, what the European Union did, it was to build an instrument that is called CBAM. CBAM was the answer to these problems, and CBAM ensured two things. The first one is that the carbon cost of imports is equivalent to the carbon cost of domestic production. And the second one, that we protect the climate objectives and targets that has been set with the legislative architecture, right? So now here, looking at this chart, we can see the higher importers in the second quarters of 2025. Last year, we see that fertilizer dominates by approximately 69%. This is followed by fertilizer, cement, aluminum, and hydrogen. For today's sessions, we will be focusing in iron and steel. Not only because of the amount of percentage that is important to the European Union within this product, but also because this is the backbone of the several key industries across member states, like automotive, construction, energy infrastructure, shipbuilding, machinery, and these are key industries here in the European Union. When we go and see the largest importer to the EU today, we can see Ukraine, Turkey, Russia, Canada, and China. But as you may know as well, because of geopolitics, conflicts, and risks, this chart may be reshaping in the future, and rapidly European Union is building a strong alliances with countries like India, Vietnam, Brazil, Southeast Asia. All of these are coming into play.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks, Prasham, Alejandra, and Kelvin for setting the tone for this particular session. I presume and I hope that now you understand the gravity of CBAM. It's not only a sustainability measure, but it's mostly a market measure, and your embedded emissions in the products as an exporter could well be a material financial risk for your customer, and few months down the line it could be your cost as well, because now customers are also working on pass-through agreements to their suppliers. So this is something which can have can really increase your operating expense, particularly of buying CBAM certificates. Now let's look at the four key actors which are, or rather four key stakeholders which are influenced or affected by CBAM. So on one side, we have importer and declarants. Now, keep in mind, CBAM being an EU regulation, so jurisdictionally, it is applicable directly on the importers or declarants. So these are your customers in the EU who are buying your products. Now, what they have to do, essentially, they'll have to fetch the data. They have to fetch the verified emissions report from yourself, put that in the CBAM registry, and it's the national competent authority, essentially each of the member states, who will validate and essentially approve the flow of material at the border. If a product is not uh, attributed, or if a product is not attached with its emissions figure, or at least the correct tariff code, then and we have seen instances over the past few months where the imports were kind of stopped at the border. So that's one stakeholder group. The second stakeholder group, and that's where the most of our discussion will lie moving ahead in these sessions, are installations and producers. Now, just to also give you a little bit of definitional understanding, so we have producers, which are also called as operators. So operators is a company which is, or an organization which essentially produces stuff and exporting it to the EU. Now, an operator can have multiple installations. Now, installations are factories or mills or plants. Now, one company could have multiple plants or multiple factories. Those individual factory locations or those individual factories are called installations. And in CBAM, the emissions reporting has to be at an installation level, further broken down at the product level. So even if a producer or an operator has four installations, let's say, they'll have to essentially prepare four different monitoring plans, and of course, entirely different emissions report for each of their products from each of the installations. Unlike your corporate level reporting, where we aggregate the emissions at the corporate level. The third stakeholder group are, of course, traders and intermediaries. We know that a lot of, particularly in metals, a lot of imports happen from traders and stockists. So these are the entities essentially who are moving the goods. They could be authorized customs representative with as well. So these are another stakeholder groups which are affected. And finally, people like myself, consultants, and our colleagues at Envana, auditors, because verification is mandatory in the definitive period moving 2026. So it has opened a wide window for auditors and for accredited verifiers. By the way, we'll discuss on the verification part. And there is another window which has opened up, that is mostly on contracting, as I touched upon earlier, on pass-through agreements and passing through the risk and liability of the CBAM cost to the supplier, or if in case it's a stockist, to the manufacturer, and all kind of corporate contracting stuff. So yeah, we can move ahead. Now, these were the four major key stakeholders group. Now, why CBAM has created a kind of a chaos in the global supply chain, particularly of materials such as iron and steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizer, hydrogen, electricity. So the heavy industries. Now, why is CBAM challenging? The first and the biggest hurdle in CBAM is getting supplier data. Now, some of you who are already aware with few of the GHG reporting standards, like GHG protocol or ISO 14064 or 67, etc. For a purchase material, one has an option to either choose a global average. Of course, they can have a supplier specific factor of the embedded emissions. While in CBAM, one has to be really specific, and they have to ensure to fetch the data, and that to verified data from the supplier. Now, what does it mean? Let's say someone is a re-roller who purchases hot roll coil from multiple suppliers, and all they do is just re-rolling, pickling, galvanizing oil, and exporting. Now, since these are the exporters, the re-roller is an exporter, they have to ensure that each of their suppliers have done actual calculation, have got a verified emissions, have got a verification statement, and do have a monitoring plan in place, even though their suppliers might not be exporting directly. So you can see how there is a cascading effect in the upstream supply chain because of CBAM. So that's one of the biggest hurdles. The second is related to methodology. Now, again, if you have tried your hands on GHG calculation, and of course there are multiple standards. Most of the standards give you a little bit of flexibility on choosing the emission factors and activity data type. However, CBAM does not. CBAM is essentially a mirror of emission trading scheme in the EU, although there are some functional variances. But the overall agenda is, if the product which is being imported in the EU, if it was produced within the EU, what would have been the system boundary and what would have been the coverage of emissions and how the emissions would have been accounted. And that's exactly what non-EU producers have to do. So the methodology are rigid, strict, and we will have a look at some of the methodology elements. Then another element is benchmark and price volatility. So now one side of the equation is your embedded emissions and the calculation of your embedded emissions. The other part of the of your whole CBAM liability equation, which we'll look at, is the free allocation. And one must calculate the free allocation based on the benchmark values given, which, unless you are already having an emission trading scheme, domestic emission trading scheme, it is very unlikely that you would have come across concepts such as free allocation and benchmark calculation. So that's another complexity of CBAM. Then, of course, data quality issues. Now, many of you might have a question that, hey, we are already reporting product level footprint. We are already calculating our PCF and LCA report. We already have a published EPD. So I think we are covered for CBAM. Well, the short answer is no, you are not, because again, the system boundaries are pretty defined in the CBAM. The calculation methodology is pretty much defined. So you have to, you either stick to those methodology or you run a risk of reporting a default value, which is on a really higher side, and that will increase your CBAM certificate obligation. So the data quality is an issue, and that is coupled with supplier data. So first of all, you have to ensure that the data quality of your own installation of your own mill, and then you also have to ensure the data quality and of course accurate emissions reporting at the supplier level. So this coupled effect has really put in the market in a frenzy, and people are really taking serious steps, taking CBAM seriously, and already establishing governance mechanisms in their own installation to deal with CBAM. Very quick look at the timeline. So right now we are in the middle of July. The definitive period, by the way, CBAM began in 2023. So since October 2023 to December of 25, it was a transition period wherein reporting was mandatory, but financial obligations were not there. So it was kind of a dry run. From January 26, it has entered its definitive period, which means that the emissions would be chargeable. The carbon tax will be charged. A few important dates to keep in mind is, number one, there is UK CBAM coming into picture from 1st of January 2027. It is almost very much similar to EU CBAM, although there are some minor variations. By February 2027, your importers have to purchase at least 50% of CBAM certificates. So it means that somewhere around February to March, they would be expecting their suppliers to provide them with verified emissions report and emission summary report. These are the two things, and of course the verification statement by an accredited verifier. So really important date to keep in mind. Again, your customers would already be reaching out to you right now. The importers are evaluating their suppliers. So yeah, you must not wait till the end of the year, because again, the whole calculation, preparing monitoring plan and getting it verified will take its own sweet little time. So yeah, better sooner than late. Next slide, please. Now, as I have touched upon verification a couple of times, so the question is, who can verify and what is the level of assurance? So the level of assurance is a reasonable assurance. So it's not a limited assurance. So that's number one. Now, the number two is, any third-party verifier cannot verify. Only an EU accredited third-party verifier can verify. And EU member nations, some of them have already opened the portal or opened the application for accreditation. Some of them would open. Very most likely by the 1st of September, almost all of the member nations will open the process for accreditation. So you must ensure that whomsoever or whomso verifier you are onboarding, that verifier must be EU accredited. Otherwise, your verified emissions will be deemed null and void. Really important point to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Yeah. So again, few key changes. One, I have already mentioned that now, in addition to reporting, the CBAM financial obligations kicks in the definitive period. The default values for definitive period are really high. So I'm not going to get into the technical details, but understand that these are the 90 percentile of the high emissions in the ETS. So that's how kind of the default values. And of course, you have country specific and product specific default. So they are designed to be on a higher side so that you pay more if you're not calculating your emissions on an actual basis. Then the methodology, there have been slight updates in the methodology and the coverage. For instance, the coverage of direct and indirect emissions. So Annex 2 goods such as iron and steel or aluminum, they need not report their indirect emissions at least till 2028. Only direct emissions are covered. While for other products like cement, indirect emissions as well as direct emissions both are covered. So the system boundary has changed a little bit, although the methodology, calculation methodology by and large remains the same as it was in the transition period. Benchmark, I have already mentioned. We have a new concept of free allocations adjustment or specific emission, a specific embedded free allocation, which is also called CEFA, which you need to calculate using the benchmark, and that will give you your exact CBAM certificate requirement. Then verification has become mandatory and CBAM certificate price are being published. So for the imports in 2026, the CBAM certificate price is it would be published on a quarterly basis, and from 2027 it would be on a weekly basis. So yeah, quarter one prices you can see 75.36 euros, and quarter two prices were also published a couple days back, which are 75 euros and 28 cents. Next slide, please. So now we will have a dive into the emission calculation, and that is the core of this whole gambit, particularly from an exporter's point of view. So three important questions: what to measure, how to measure, and when to measure. So what to measure? That will be defined by the system boundaries which are established. System boundaries are, so you may have come across these terms such as cradle to gate, cradle to grave, cradle to cradle. Now these are all system boundaries. Um, in GG protocol, you have organizational and operational boundaries. Similarly, in CBAM, you have system boundaries which establishes which processes you need to account for your emissions, which would be liable for carbon tax, and which processes you need not to account for your calculations. For instance, you need not calculate and report your emissions from mobile combustion, from your transportation, while of course you need to calculate the emissions from, say, your furnaces, from your process emissions, emissions from your carbonates, etc. So that's the system boundary, which says what to measure. How to measure is essentially uh, the calculation methodology and the specific rules which you must follow, and you must report your emissions as on an intensity basis. So intensity means tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of functional unit or per functional unit. Now, for most of the products, functional unit is tons of goods, except cement, where the functional unit is tons of clinker, and except fertilizer products, some of the mixed fertilizer, where it's tons of nitrogen, and of course electricity, where the functional unit is kilowatt hours. And when to measure? So the reporting period is a calendar year. So you have to have, essentially every year you have to prepare your annual emissions report and get it verified by an EU accredited body. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just a visual illustration of your emission sources and what are covered and what are not. So direct emissions are covered. What is excluded from direct emissions are emissions from mobile equipments, essentially emissions from mobile combustions like your transportation, etc. What's not covered is emissions from your, say, refrigerants and fire extinguishers, these kind of fugitive emissions. Keep in mind, not all fugitive emissions. So flue gas cleaning, etc. Those emissions you must account. Now, indirect emissions are included. That is emissions from consumed electricity. Of course, for Annex 2 goods, they are not included, as I've already mentioned earlier. And with regards to value chain emissions, you must account for embedded emissions in your precursor. Now, precursor is an input material. However, all input materials are not your precursors. Precursors are only those input materials which by themselves are CBAM goods. Now, going back to the example of a re-roller. So the re-roller is purchasing hot roll coil from, let's say, 5 suppliers, and they're doing some preheating, pre-treatment, galvanization, pickling, some CRC, etc., and they're exporting it off. Now, these guys are purchasing hot roll coil, which in itself is a CBAM good. Thus, hot roll coil will be deemed as a precursor. In other cases wherein, so let's say primary aluminum production will not have any precursor as such, because your input material becomes essentially your aluminum ore, and then you are producing unwrought aluminum. So precursor are those input materials which themselves are CBAM goods. All precursors are input materials, but all input materials are not precursors. And for the precursors, you must report the embedded emissions, add them up into your final product emissions. And where would you get the emissions of precursors from? You will get it from your suppliers. So again, really important to have supply chain engagement in place. Next slide, please. Yeah, I have already illustrated this point. So functional unit is by and large ton of good, particularly for iron and steel, it's tons of good, except these are the exceptions: cement, mixed fertilizer, and electricity. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now, again, you would have already now have got an idea of, of emissions. Now you have the option to either report emissions based on the actual methodology specified in specified in the implementation regulation, or you just report the default value, which is published by the commission. And as expressed earlier, default values are designed punitively. So they are already on a higher side. On top of that, there is a markup. So for 2026, the markup is 10%. So default value multiplied by 1.1. So that's become your essentially yearly default value. For 2027, the markup is 20%, and for 2028, the markup is 30%. So it is a risk. The more, the more you rely on default value, essentially the embedded your product emissions will be very high, and your customers will have to pay really high, and then perhaps they'll choose other supplier who are reporting actual emissions and getting it verified. So now we will have a look at the key requirements and methodologies for steel products and steel product categories. Next, please. And we will finish it up with a quick example of calculation, so that to give you a flavor on essentially how to do it. Of course, the session is too short to deep dive into real calculation, but at least you'll get a fair idea. Now, on iron and steel products, first of all, we begin with sinter ore. So sinter ore from a sinter plant. So that is again a precursor, or it is also itself a CBAM good. Key emissions would be your process carbonates emissions from limestone, fuel combustions from, say, waste gases, your cocoa 1 gas, etc., which are transferred into this particular process for preheating, and of course emissions from flue gas cleaning, particularly if you're using carbonates for flue gas cleaning. Ferroalloys, now particularly not all ferroalloys, but we are talking about 3 ferroalloys: ferrochrome, ferromanganese, and yeah, and the other one. So essentially, we are not talking about the other ferroalloys like ferrovanadium. It is not a CBAM good. But ferrochrome, ferronickel, and ferromanganese, these are the 3 ferroalloys which are covered under CBAM. And again, if you're using a submerged arc furnace, so there would be some process emissions, again, from reductant fluxes, carbonates, etc., and of course, fuel combustion emissions. So those are the direct emissions which must be accounted for. And again, really important to follow a mass balance approach, because in the output, again, in case of ferroalloy, in the output itself, you will have some solid carbon. You will have solid embedded carbon in the slag. You will have solid carbon in your ferrochrome or ferronickel or ferromanganese. And you must deduct the solid carbon which is coming out of this system as solid carbon. So that has not been oxidized and it has not been transformed into a gaseous CO2. Thus, you must subtract it. And you will only be able to do it if you are following a mass balance approach. Otherwise, you run a risk of essentially oxidizing all the input carbon, and then it will in a way inflate your emissions. Next slide, please. Yeah, then pig iron, Spiegeleisen, DRI. So these are all CBAM goods covered under CBAM. So more or less the emission sources are fuel and reducting agents, process carbonates, and we must follow a mass balance technique. Same applies again further basic oxygen steel making or electric arc furnace. You're making secondary steel, secondary metallurgy. Again, really important to follow mass balance approach to adjust for the output solid carbon. One must also ensure that for all the input solid material, they also have embedded carbon in those. So let's say in an electric arc furnace, secondary steel making, you are using scrap steel, which will have embedded carbon in it. So one must track those. Again, there is a really rigid prescribed framework on how to track and how to do the sampling, in what kind of labs one must do the sampling, etc. So again, really important to be on top of the methodological requirements. And then further, these are your all kinds of semi-finished or coils, long products, flat products, 7318, such as fasteners like screws and all. So all of these are your CBAM goods. So first of all, you must check if the goods which you're exporting is a CBAM good or not. Just verify the CN codes. So first four are parent codes. So you can also verify. And by the way, CN codes is an extension of HSN codes. So you can ask your sales team and they would know the HSN code of the product which you're exporting. Moving ahead. Yeah. Now, as I had expressed earlier, that uh, you cannot choose any emission factor or you cannot choose any factor. Now, there is a list of hierarchy which one must follow. Now, this is an increasing order of accuracy from top to bottom. So the lowest accuracy is type 1 standard values, which are published by the commission. Type 2 are other standard values, which are, say, regional factors, such as, say, DEFRA factor for the UK. Now, those would be type 2 standard values, or if you have some country-specific or region-specific emission factors, those will be type 2 values. Then a higher accuracy is establishing proxies for gross calorific value or net calorific value and the input and the quantities. And of course, higher accuracy is lab analysis. If it's a non-accredited lab, then that would be kind of level 4. And finally, and of the highest level is accredited lab analysis. Now, the reason why this hierarchy is important is, let's say if you could not do an accredited lab analysis and you relied on a type 1 standard value, you must give an explanation, or you must give a you must give a statement with a calculation that I was not able to perform a calculation of higher accuracy because of, say, unreasonable cost or technical infeasibility. So these two things one must prove. And again, there are specific formulas on how to prove it. So say you have to estimate the percentage reduction, and per ton of reduction is priced at 80 euros, and then you have to find the cost and everything, and you have to demonstrate a cost benefit to the verifier. If you're unable to demonstrate the cost benefit and still you followed a lower data quality, then the verifier will flag it as a non-conformity and you run the risk of non-verification. So really important point. Moving ahead. Yeah, this is the same, the unreasonable cost test. Essentially, again, I won't spend a lot of time, but the idea is the same. You have to justify the tier which you are, or the level of emission factor which you are choosing, and you have to justify that why you were not able to achieve a higher level of emission of values. Yeah, so just to summarize theoretically, your step by step. So first, define the system boundaries, your functional unit, and check sector specific rules, of course. Then measure your emissions. So either a mass balance based approach or calculation, or a mix of both. So let's say for fuel, you are using a calculation approach, and for material, for process emissions, you are following a mass balance approach. Then calculate or fetch the data from your supplier for your precursors. Again, add them up. Finally, attribute the emissions to the goods at the goods level. So then you will get your SEE, that is specific embedded emissions, always expressed in tons of CO2 per functional unit. And yeah, finally prepare a report and get your report verified by an EU accredited verifier. Next, please. Yeah, again a checklist. Now the earlier roadmap was for calculation. Now there are other elements in addition to the calculation, and what those elements are, you would see on point number 2 is a monitoring plan. Now monitoring plan is again a mandatory document which you must prepare. While it's an internal document, it must be in English, and it is a recipe book. It's kind of a cookbook. So how you came across your calculations, how you identify your processes, how you identify the system boundaries, what are the measurement principles, etc. So all of those have to be part of the monitoring plan, which the verifier will refer while doing their verification. If your monitoring plan is again not in line with the requirements specified in A5 of the implementation regulation, you run the risk of non-conformity, which will be flagged in the verification report. So again, really important. And yeah, of course, gather precursor data for electricity. Again, really important to have evidences. Again, few questions you might have in mind. So let's say we are buying IREX or unbundled energy attribute certificates. Would they qualify as zero emissions? Well, the short answer is no. Unless you prove either a direct line transfer or you prove through a physical PPA, you prove via grid transfer. If you can prove the real-time matching, then only you can claim zero emissions for your renewable electricity purchase. Again, really important point to keep in mind. Next, please.
Thanks, Rabu. We had a poll here, but I'm just going to skip it, just conscious of time, just make sure that we cover all the important slides. So yeah, carry on.
Yeah. And the final leg of this session is on a sample case for an integrated blast furnace basic oxygen steel making plant. So next, please. So let's say there's the statement. So there is an operator in Vietnam named XYZ Steel. They're exporting to their EU customer. It's an integrated blast furnace, basic oxygen steel making, integrated steel plant. They also have their on-site captive thermal power plant, and they produce hot rolled coil for the market. The hot rolled coil, which is the CN code is 72081000, are being sold to the EU, and their customers are asking for three things now to comply with the CBAM requirements. Number one, calculation of their actual specific embedded emissions, direct because it's iron and steel, so indirect not required till 2028. Calculation of benchmark to understand your free allocation and then understand your CBAM certificate obligation, and then finally the CBAM cost for 50,000 tons of imports, which is being done by the EU customer. So we will try to find the answer for all these three. Next, please. So this is a schematic diagram of the plant. Again, you can see, so first we begin with the center plant. Now center plant will have inputs such as your iron ore, coke fines, both of them will have some embedded carbon in them. Of course, there are fuel input. Then you make center ore, goes to the blast furnace. In the blast furnace, you have other reductants, your coke, lime, some scrap steel, of course, and natural gas. Then further, the waste gas from or your blast furnace gas is being transferred to your on-site power plant, which is generating electricity, feeding back to your secondary metallurgy process, your auxiliary equipments, and in your hot strip mill. And then you have the pig iron being produced, goes into LD convert. So it's a regular kind of usual integrated steel plant. And finally, you in your hot strip mill, you are producing hot rolled coil and it is being sold to the market. So kind of a usual, yet few things such as blast furnace gas being utilized as an energy input for thermal power plant. These are things are additional, which you will find usually in many of the large integrated blast furnace BS steel plant. So this is our production process. So now step one, you must map your production process something like this. You must map the flows of inputs, input material, input energy, output energy, waste, slag, etc. So that's the process flow diagram right there. Next, please. Now then we do the calculation. So while we are assuming that none of the crude steel, could you go back to one slide, please, Kelvin? Yeah. Now, while in this example, we are assuming that none of the crude steel from your converter is being sold to the market, which means all your crude steel is being fed into your continuous casting in for further in your hot strip mill. So that's an important assumption over here. Next, please. So now, since nothing is going out of the system directly to the market, we can club these. It's called a bubble approach. So we can kind of combine these 5 production processes into a single process, and then we collect the activity data. So essentially our input material and input energy. So on the left hand side, you can see consumption level. So you have input materials, coke, fine, iron ore, coke. You're also using some plastic waste, say internal scrap, external scrap, some home scrap, cancelled lime, natural gas, and other inputs. You have identified the quantities. and the carbon content. Now, this is a better way to do your calculation. Now, since we are doing a mass balance calculation, it's always advisable to perform a carbon analysis, get your carbon analysis done in the lab, and then do the calculation as per the carbon content. So you have identified those. Biomass fraction, you have some biomass fraction in plastic waste, which is 23%. Now, again, if you're using biomass, it must be RED 2 compliant or RED 3 compliant. Otherwise, you cannot claim a zero rated biomass. And even before that, to even identify the biomass, you either need to have a carbon 14 isotope test done for your exhaust, or at least at the input, you should have wave bridges, which essentially records the input of biomass. Two really important things to keep in mind. And then you just calculate the emissions. So which is your carbon activity data multiplied with the carbon content multiplied with the expansion factor, that is 44/12, and you will get these numbers. Then there are carbons in the output, which I have mentioned in the mass balance. You must perform an output subtraction also. So such as in your crude steel and in your slags, there are some percentage of carbon which is going out of the system as solid carbon. So we must deduct those CO2 emissions from there. And then we must also deduct the CO2 emissions from blast furnace gases, which are being transferred to the captive power plant and to the reheating furnace. And once you do this, you get the final direct emissions for your crude steel. You divide it with the crude steel level of crude steel production, and you get the specific embedded emissions of crude steel. Next, please. Now we will calculate the specific embedded emissions of the hot roll coil, which is being exported. So for hot roll coil, your input is crude steel. And as we can see, the blast furnace gas was being transferred into the reheating furnace, and natural gas was an external fuel which you were using. Kind of same application, and we calculated the specific embedded direct emissions of hot roll coil, which is of course more than specific embedded emissions for crude steel, because of course there are further processes such as the reheating and furnaces, etc. But our job is not done yet, because we also purchased some ferroalloys, and there were additional inputs in our system. And some of them, like in this example, you can see ferrochrome is a CBAM good, and the supplier was unable to provide actual verified emissions. So we must use the default value for our input precursor, in this case ferroalloys. So you use that. The mass ratio is essentially for 1 ton of your final product, how many tons of input material you need. That's a mass ratio. So you must adjust for the mass ratio, and then you go, your final embedded emissions direct is 1.69 for hot roll coil. Next, please. So that gives you the answer for question A, which is calculate embedded emissions. Now we move to part B, which is the benchmark or free allocations. So for that, this is a simple equation. I'll walk you through. So you can see the description. So you have the specific embedded emissions on the extreme left in the second bracket. Then in the first bracket, you have CBAM benchmark, which needs to be calculated, and then the phase-in factor. Phase-in factor is predefined. For 2026, it is 97.5%. From 2027, it is 95%. So it's kind of predefined. And then again, outside the second bracket, you have the CBAM price, which is published quarterly for this particular year. And then you subtract the carbon price paid in the domestic market. If you are governed under your own ETS, you subtract the price which you are paying already over there, and then that becomes your CBAM price for the whole ton of material. So essentially, we have everything in this equation except the CBAM benchmark, and which we will quickly calculate in the next slide. Next, please. Yeah, so CBAM benchmark is essentially again doing the same thing. It's called a kind of a Russian doll model. So a recursive calculation for each of your processes and preceding processes. You keep adding the benchmark values which are published by the commission and keep adjusting those with the mass ratio. So for example, hot roll coil is a final process. Hot roll mill is a final process. Hot roll coil is a final product. So you first take the benchmark value for that. Then the preceding process, which was a crude steel production, you add the benchmark for crude steel production, adjust for the mass ratio. So let's say there is a 98% yield from crude steel to hot rolled coil. So you divide that value by 0.98, the benchmark of crude steel, and you keep adding those. Further, you will have pig iron, you add those. Then upstream will have say sintered ore, you add those. Or in case of scrap, you will beyond crude steel, you might not have, unless you are using say pig iron or etc. So this is how recursively you calculate the benchmark, and you keep adding those. And column A benchmark values. Column B benchmark values are default values. You can only use them if you are reporting default emissions. Next, please. So this is what essentially, yeah, next, please. So this is again a simplistic description of the same plant. And these are the mass ratios in the bracket, which you can see. Text in purple are precursors, and other non-purple are non-precursors. So we must only concern ourselves with the precursor or the CBAM goods themselves. In the table below, BMG star are the benchmark values, column A, which are given by the commission. So for the respective CN codes, input quantity is essentially the mass ratio for per ton of hot rolled coil, and you multiply BMG star with the input quantity, you get the adjusted benchmark, you add them all up and sum it up. So it comes at, say, 1.303 for this particular plant. Now, next, please. So now we have the part B of the equation. We put that in here, and next, please. Yeah, so we get a result of 31.59 euros per ton. So this is going to be the cost of per ton of HRC being exported by that Vietnamese installation. And for 50,000 tons of import, this is the total cost. We are looking at 1.58 million euros, which is a considerable cost. And even and by the way, in this case, you have done actual emission calculation. Now, the question is, what if we don't do this whole mess of calculation and we just report the default values? So let's see how much it's going to cost. Next, please. Now, if you report default values, of course, the equation remains the same. The two things change there. Part one, which is the default value, you must enter the default value now, which is 2.585 for this particular CN code from Vietnam. And you must use the default benchmark, which is column B, not the actual benchmarks which we calculated. So which is 1.37. Rest everything remains the same. And you do the calculation and you get a figure of 94 euros per ton of cost if you are reporting default values. So you can see the difference. On one hand, your importers need to pay 1.5 million for 50,000 tons. And on the other hand, if you are reporting default emissions, your importer must pay 4.7 million. And of course, tomorrow they might ask you to pay for that. So the difference is considerable. The delta is considerable. And I think the reason for this example was just to help you give a pragmatic understanding of the costs and the difference and the delta cost associated with actual versus default values. Then you finally prepare a report, a full detailed report and a summary report. They both can be one report as long as all the contents are there. And yeah, if you have already registered in the CBAM registry, you can directly transmit it over there, or you can share it with your customer post verification. So for 2026, all the materials which are being imported as we speak into the EU are already subject to carbon tax. The only thing is they have to pay next year in 2027, but they're already being subjected to carbon tax, which means the inbuilt emissions of a product which is being exported right now is already subjected to carbon tax. So it's really prudent to take steps straight away. Next, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Rubu. Thank you. That was great. I think it's clear to kind of see the importance of actually calculating these things and actually going through and defining your system boundaries, not using defaults. We can see the huge cost associated with kind of using defaults. And so, yeah, it's prudent that people go out there and actually try and speak to the suppliers, try and get actual values. So now that we've covered that, I know we've only got sort of 4 minutes left. I just wanted to kind of touch briefly on how Envana can support with this. We can support you with applying sort of the right calculation methodologies for your specific products, a structure for your, sort of structure your monitoring plan, and kind of get everything audit ready for your verification. So that you're not trying to figure this all out by yourself from scratch. As you can see with the calculation methodology, the formulas itself, they all seem kind of complex. And if you're coming into it applying the standard GHG protocol methodology across these calculations, then you're probably going to miss a step and you're probably going to go wrong somewhere. And so we're here to support. We've got time for one or two questions right now, but so we'll open the floor for those one or two questions if you've got any.
Someone had a question. So how LCAs within different boundaries reconcile with CBAM calculations? From one of our viewers.
Ruben, do you want to take that?
Yeah, Kelvin. So, well, to begin with, I will not recommend to reconcile different system boundaries of LCA with CBAM calculation. There are, it's very likely to run into trouble. Why? Because let's say your system boundary for LCA is cradle to gate. Okay, let's not cradle to grave. So you're not talking about a downstream, which is excluded from CBAM. Only cradle to gate. Even then, let's say for input materials, you are using emission factors. So let's say you are using an eco-invent database, a global factor or regional factor. Now, those factors are essentially, first of all, not accepted. Either you report a default value published by the commission, or you do the actual precursor emission calculation from your from your supplier. So that's the first challenge over there. Second is, again, for all input materials in the LCA using an eco-invent or a grid database, you are accounting for all your input materials. While in CBAM, you must only account for your precursor input material. So again, that's a major difference over there. And for your gate-to-gate emissions, say for process emissions, in LCA might be treating your process emissions based on general default. Let's say for CSU3, it might takes a complete oxidation and the standard emission factor for these kind of stuff. So again, it's not really advisable to reconcile LC into CBAM, and the best way and how I'd recommend is to start with CBAM calculation afresh. While there could be some parallels, but it's likely to, I mean, yeah, it may get too intertwined and too tangled for yourself. So better to start afresh.
Okay. All right, perfect. I think that answers that. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Ribu, Prasham, and Alejandra for the sort of great insights that you shared today. And thank you all for joining, for and asking that great question and for interacting along with the session. If you can reach out to us by hello@envana.com, or you can interact with our website. But we'll send the recording and slides shortly. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.